international jihadist movement has declared war. They have declared war and already are executing it on a massive scale on a whole range of countries with which they are in contact.
Harsh words today from the Prime Minister about the rising acts of violence carried out by those with extreme ideologies. Yesterday's brutal attack in Paris has reignited the debate about what's driving what the Prime Minister called a global jihadist movement and what might be done to mitigate the threat. Now, in France, there have already been some incidents of backlash against some Muslims and mosques in the wake of the attack, as the French ambassador spoke about. And they've also got the rise politically of the Front National, the National Front, with Marine Le Pen, a party rising in the polls that is very anti-immigration and has said very anti-Islamic things. What's causing the culture clash? Should there be limits on either publishing cartoons or should there be limits on other things, or no limits at all? Is this just the exercise of free expression or adding fuel to the fire? There's lots of debate going on in France right now. We're going to get a couple different perspectives on what's happened and the fallout. Listening in from Toronto, and I'll speak to him in a minute, is the director of the Canadian Arab Federation, Mohamed El Rashidy. He's going to come on the program in a minute, but I want to bring in Mark Steyn first. He's the best-selling author and commentator, author of Lights Out, Islam, Free Speech, and the Twilight of the West. He joins me in Manchester, New Hampshire. Mark, good to have you back on the program. Obviously, an outspoken advocate of freedom of the press and free speech. You've written about this. You've written about the situation in France before. What was your reaction when you heard about the Charlie Hebdo attack?
Well, I was devastated. There were basically only two publications in the major Western nations that published the Danish Mohammed cartoons after a bunch of people had gotten killed over them. The only two publications to republish them were Charlie Hebdo in Paris and the magazine I was then writing for in Canada, the Western Standard. And so these poor guys at Charlie Hebdo had to bear a burden that should have been more widely dispersed. It's one thing to say these Mohammed cartoons from Denmark are lousy, they're not funny, I don't want to publish them if you're the cartoon editor of the New Yorker. But once they're a news story and people are being killed over them, then all this sort of pixelating Mohammed's image as if he's entered the witness protection program is frankly pathetic. And I was devastated that these brave guys in Paris had stood up for almost 9 years to threats of death and were finally taken out. And just to tie it back in to what you were talking about earlier, the reason there wasn't a death toll like this at the Canadian Parliament is because Kevin Vickers understood in a split second what was going on and prevented that guy from ramping up the same kind of corpse count. And so you can, in a military and policing sense, operate on that kind of trigger, whereby you're alert to military and security threats. But it's a much broader cultural issue, I think, where this question will really eventually be settled.
Let's talk about the cultural issue, because there's lots of concerns here. One concern, it will rise. There'll be a rise in Islamophobia in France. 8% of the population is Muslim there. There's a concern that far-right political parties like the Front National will use a xenophobic agenda to gain power. What is your concern about that in France or in Europe?
Well, you know, every time we hear this Muslims fear backlash thing, in the Sydney coffee shop incident a couple of weeks before Christmas, they'd launched the Muslims fear backlash storyline before the hostage siege in the coffee shop had ended. There was a parody headline after the July 7th tube bombings in London a decade ago that somebody put up on the internet: Muslims fear backlash over tomorrow's train bombing. And in fact, the backlash does not really happen, because actually the citizens of Western nations have been very accommodating and very welcoming of immigrants. The question, though, is whether in return those immigrants are willing to accept the burdens of a pluralistic society. It doesn't mean that everybody wants to open up an AK-47 on you, Evan, but it does mean fellas like Ali Salim. You were talking about Ireland a couple of minutes ago. Ali Salim is a professor at Trinity College, Dublin, and he has threatened the Irish press with taking them to court if they republish any of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. So he's not picking up a gun, but nor is he willing to be a fully functioning member of a Western society.
You know, people talk about this, and this debate is happening in France. But, you know, the facts are, and I want your reaction to this, 8% of the population in France is Muslim. There is a genuine problem that about they have a different philosophy. We have a multicultural society. In Canada, they have a more assimilation issue there. But they've had a real issue of integration and a genuine issue. But you've been on the forefront of saying there's a concern about Islamic society taking over Europe when many people have pointed out there's actually no evidence of that. I'll just say, you know, the study like Religiousness and Fertility Among European Muslims by demographers Charlie Westhoff and Thomas Frejka say that, in fact, you know, there's no Muslim families have no more children than non-Muslim families. So there's no real fear of the kind of thing that you've stoked. And people have pointed to someone like you of raising fears that are unjustified about this.
Well, you know, there's studies and there's studies. What's fascinating is the first Pakistani immigrants to the United Kingdom in the 1960s adjusted to British-style birth rates. And then as their numbers grew, they resumed something closer to Pakistani birth rates. Tunisians in Europe actually have children at a higher rate than Tunisians in Tunisia. So there's all kinds of evidence for that. And, you know, Evan, you and I have been back and forth on this several times, and we can meet in 20 years' time at your favorite falafel restaurant on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré and see who's right. But you cannot, what is hard to deny, you said 8% of the population of France is Muslim. It's actually probably closer to 10%. But the fact is that as a society becomes more Muslim, certain self-segregating elements set in. And that is what has happened in France, where it's not like having Slovenes and Filipinos and all kinds of other people all jumbling up together and integrating, but in fact a consciously self-segregating bloc. That's, by the way, why Pakistan is not part of an independent India, because they wanted to be a self-segregating bloc too.
But
so there is an issue here, and whether it's 15 or 20%, once you get an Islamic population up to a certain size, it poses certain cultural challenges on things like freedom of speech.
All right, we had a little delay here, so it's difficult for you and I to go back and forth, but let me just challenge you on a couple of statistics. Is it 8 or 10%? The French ambassador was on this program earlier. He said 8% stats I've seen. France is 8%, slightly more than 4% of Europe overall is defined as Muslim by demographers. So when you say we could quibble about 15 or 20%, even by 2020, according to most demographic studies that I see, first of all, there's no chance of that. You know, maybe 8% if it even doubles. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what's wrong with meeting at a falafel joint? You use it as if that's a pejorative. Great. You know, what we've had in Canada and the United States and all over Europe is immigrants come, and most statistics have borne out that immigrants integrate on our economic benefits. And I guess my question fundamentally is, here we are in a very, just a second, in a very difficult moment because of what this horrific act, and the fear is that people will use this act to start stoking fears about the Muslim population. The lion's share, most of them have nothing to do with this and have condemned this kind of horrific attack and are contributors peacefully to society.
It's never a numbers game, Evan. By the way, though, if you want to talk numbers, 1 in 10 births in the United Kingdom are to Muslims. The French ambassador who was on your show, by the way, his government doesn't keep statistics about religious faith. The Austrian government does, and the Demography Institute there has predicted that by the year 2040, a majority of Austrians under the age of 18 will be Muslim. Just to go back to that British statistic, if 1 in 10 of your young people is Muslim, then at the minimum you're looking at a 10% Muslim population. But I've got nothing against falafel if it was left at falafel. But freedom of speech is not as universally desired as falafel. And that's the disturbing thing about that Trinity College professor I mentioned, Evan, that there is simply not the same acceptance of intellectual inquiry in the Muslim world. We all know this. And when you say, oh, the majority of Muslims don't want to do this and don't want to do that, we report the same story you do on your news station every week now. This is just this week's atrocity. A couple of weeks ago it was Sydney. A couple of weeks before that it was Ottawa. And the reason you have to keep protesting that Islam is a religion of peace quite as often as you do is because every couple of weeks somebody kills someone, someone blows up something, someone runs over a guy with a car in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, and as they're speeding off they're yelling Allahu Akbar.
Yeah,
and until moderate Muslims actually are willing to do something about that, we are right to put a big question mark over Islam's ability to function in pluralistic, advanced society.
Okay, and I know we've got Mohamed El Rashidy listening, but I just want to pick up on something you just said. You made a generalization that I found real dangerous. You said, we know they're, quote, intellectually less curious. Now, first of all, I don't know how you'd say that. Second of all, I mean, look, there's lots of statistics. 5 out of the last 13 Nobel Prize winners were Muslim. I mean, I don't know where, I mean, this is the kind of generalization that becomes very dangerous. And I guess and I know this debate's going on in France politically and it's playing out, and I know it's stylish to say it's politically incorrect, but I guess my point is generalizations like this about 1 billion people are difficult to justify.
Well, I'll tell you where I got it from. I got it from the United Nations. They did a famous survey 5 or 6 years ago that discovered that more books are translated into Spanish every year than have been translated into Arabic in the last 1,000 years. And that's why you and I can have this back and forth. And if the fellows who disagreed with Charlie Hebdo, Evan, had wanted to have this back and forth, I would have no problem with it. I've got no problem with anyone who wants to disagree with me, insult me, put me down, as your next guest is happy to do. But when I make a point and the other fella's reaction is to reach for his scimitar and chop your head off, which was the reaction of the fellas who objected to the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, then sorry, that is an intellectually defective culture. And until the death threats end, then I'm on the side of the people who do the culturally insensitive cartoons and the provocative plays and the unacceptable novels, because I'll take freedom of speech over the guy reaching for his scimitar any day of the week. And you know you would too, Evan. You know you would too.
The problem is you're painting a caricature. Everyone would. And most Muslims would too. This is the problem. Nobody is condoning going into a magazine like Charlie Hebdo and gunning down cartoonists. And I have not heard any mainstream Muslim imam do the same thing. So my point here is not that anyone's justifying massacres, horrors, and murder. No one does. I guess my concern is that these terrorists, these psychopaths that try to justify that. By the way, the same way Andres Breivik did it when he did his horrible massacre and called himself a Christian soldier. And did we have Christian ministers going out there saying we're concerned about Christianity? No, he was dismissed as a psychopath.
Well, I think the way to look at the reaction here, you say nobody's condoning this. But people are reacting to it, and their reaction is one of fear and cowardice. Like, for example, the cartoon in the National Post. this morning by Gary Clement, one of my old colleagues from the National Post days. And it's like all the cartoons expressing solidarity with the dead around the world. They're cowed, they're craven, they're not addressing the central issue, which is that these guys were killed because they did a cartoon of Mohammed. And the way to stop people being killed for cartooning Mohammed is for everybody to reprint those cartoons. But Gary Clement wouldn't acknowledge that in the National Post this morning, nor did the cartoonists in the United States, nor the United Kingdom, nor Australia, nor Europe, nor all over the world. We're sending the message, we're incentivizing violence. And there's no reason for anybody to apply pressure to stop violence because we are rewarding these people with violence. These were very brave men who died. And the people and the people who affect solidarity with them all under this absurd hashtag Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie, don't have an ounce of the courage that those guys displayed and aren't willing to do what those guys did. And that is why we are incentivizing violence and more people will die. And that's the problem. More books will go unpublished, more art exhibitions will be cancelled, more plays will never be produced, more films will never be made.
And listen, the debate about whether everyone should be showing those cartoons is a very legitimate debate in defense of free speech, and no one's arguing this horrific attack on free speech is unjustifiable. Mark Steyn, author of Lights Out, Islam, Free Speech, and The Twilight of the West. It's always good to have you on the program. You know, and as you and I both say, we champion debate where you know you're safe to engage in ideas. Sir, thank you so much for coming on.
It's always a pleasure, Evan. Good to talk with you.
That is Mark Steyn. All right, now, listening into that discussion, I know these are passionate debates, and we always try to have passionate debates on power and politics. And that's the whole, listen, that is the beauty of our democracy. You're free to disagree with people and have different opinions, but you're safe to do so, which stands in stark contrast to what happened in France. But we'll get Mohamed El Rashidy. He's been listening into Mark Steyn. Here he is, and man, he's certainly ready to respond. I know Mohamed El Rashidy, director of the Canadian Arab Federation. He's next. Stay with us. Welcome back to Power and Politics. The manhunt for the two suspects in the Paris shootings yesterday continues right now out of Paris. We have no word as to how close the police might be to ending that. In the midst of that, there's a real conversation about the rise of extreme ideology and the acts of violence carried out by some in the name of Islam, like the attack in Paris yesterday. Now, just before the break, we heard from the outspoken author and commentator Mark Steyn. He says the media has a duty to publish those controversial cartoons that lampoon religion, and he says there's a politically correct debate that is preventing us from having a real debate about immigration and about the religion of Islam. Some have accused him of trying to incite xenophobia. Listening into that conversation has been someone you've seen regularly on this program, and we wanted to get his perspective on, is there a growing culture clash in France, and what about what Mark Steyn just had to say? In Toronto is the director of the Canadian Arab Federation, Mohamed El Rashidy. And Mohamed El Rashidy, thanks, of course, for being here. You were here yesterday as well. Mark Steyn, on the other side of the break, had a very passionate debate and his views about what he calls the Muslim issue, the problem in Europe. And of course, many people find some of those words controversial. Or where are you on what he said?
Yes, Evan, thank you for having me on and for giving different sides of this argument. I think that's very important. We're obviously very fortunate to be in Canada where this sort of thing happens. Too many countries, and to some extent even France, doesn't allow this type of debate where you get to hear the different sides. So I'm glad that we're doing this. In terms of the rise of Islamophobia, there's no question that you're going to have that as a reaction. There are bigots everywhere, and really they look for excuses to respond with violence to these sorts of things. We've seen bombings of mosques and other Muslim targets in France, and we have that throughout many countries, not just in France, certainly in Europe, to a lesser extent in the United States, and to an even lesser extent in Canada. I think leadership is very important from the top to address Islamophobia and the attacks that result from these kinds of actions by religious extremists and terrorists. So that's sort of the first point. And obviously the actions, as I said yesterday, Evan, it's important to reiterate that they're barbaric and there's no justification whatsoever to carry out violence, let alone murder against somebody that you disagree with. I can't underscore that enough.
And I think fair enough. There's widespread condemnation about this from all aspects. What do you make of what Mark Steyn's saying about, his point is that there has no separation, he argues, between church and state in Islam. In other words, that the tolerance for things like satire, like depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, that causes this kind of horrific backlash. And he says there's not enough moderate Muslims are standing up for that. In the same way, for example, satire of Jews or Christians, or look at Monty Python's The Life of Brian. That kind of stuff is tolerated, and yet a cartoon about the Prophet Muhammad isn't. His view is there's a difference, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about that.
Yeah, but you raise really good points with comments like the Muslim problem. As somebody who studied race relations and is aware of the history, certainly of Europe, in relation to minorities, when I hear something like the Muslim problem, I can't help but think of going back to the 1800s and the mid-1900s and what happened to Jewish communities there with the Jewish problem. And so it's very frustrating to see essentially over time musical chairs being played by minority groups, one replaced after the other, when the lesson should be that racism and discrimination are wrong, period. It shouldn't be okay to one day discriminate against one group and then switch to another. In terms of the numbers game that I keep hearing and how Europe is becoming Muslim, and you made a good point about the falafel stand. I don't understand really what are we getting at when we say that we have a problem and that a country is becoming Muslim. Is that so? Do you want to sterilize Muslims? Do you want to ban mixed marriages? I mean, what arguments are we getting at? It's a very slippery slope.
This is fascinating. We had this debate here in Quebec when under the PQ they talked about a charter of values. You had Tony Blair in the UK, and even to a certain extent David Cameron, and they're talking about values. And then this is touchy stuff, but some countries believe they have certain values, and this is this whole program. And in France is a fascinating example. They are open about, quote, assimilating to what are French values. The debate we had in Quebec, which was so controversial, is how it is. It passed, as you know, under Sarkozy in France. What do you make of that? Is there a dark side to that?
Yeah, there's a very dark side. Okay, so there's a difference in values. Is somebody telling me that my values are somehow different than another person because of, I don't even know, because of my genetics or because of what exactly? And you know, we need to flesh that out. I think it's a healthy debate to have. We need to flesh that out more. I've been practicing law for what, over 10 years now. Is somebody saying that Muslims commit more crime than non-Muslims? Because I haven't seen that in courtrooms that I've been in. I don't see the docket overwhelmingly representing one group more than the other. It's a reflection of society and other different factors. Is that the argument that some people are more violent than others as a result of, you know, it gets very, very touchy, as you say. I reject it outright, and I think specific examples need to be brought forward so that we can address them. But these generalizations are very troubling.
What about when he says, what about, again, I'm going back to what Steyn says. What about when he says we don't hear enough condemnation of violence and radicalism from moderate imams? Now, we've had a lot of imams on this program. And you know, when a radical Christian or a radical Jew or a radical Hindu performs an act of violence, you don't get that whole community saying, you know, they don't represent it. It does happen for sure for the Muslim world, and people, you know, media outlets go, oh, you know, let's try to have a better understanding of Islam. But what's your sense of that? Is there a struggle within the religion of Islam, you know, over who speaks for, what it represents? There are many sects. You know, it's not a monolith.
Yeah, and you got over 1.6 billion people who associate with Islam, who call themselves Muslims. You've got 53 countries in the world who are majority Muslim, and then you've got the rest of the Muslims spread out in various countries. So the most populous Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. and Arabs compose a small percentage of Muslims, less than 20% of Muslims around the world. It's very mixed, so it's very difficult as someone who's aware of the Muslim world to make generalizations, not only as unique individuals, but as nations spread out through continents. It's amazing to me that we can generalize about such a large group of people spread throughout the world. But to your point, I think that we have to sort of be careful when somebody comes at it from that point, because, yes, Evan, you're saying?
I got 30 seconds, and one of the points I just want you to answer, just to make sure people get a fair response here. Steyn on the other side, many people are tweeting that they don't like his views. Some people do like his views, obviously very polarizing stuff. But at the end, he said, whatever you think, he believes that the world should be publishing the cartoons that were very controversial. First, the Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, and then the cartoons, the satirical cartoons of Charlie Hebdo. He thinks it's incumbent on media organizations to show all of those cartoons. Would you support the publication of those cartoons? No,
Evan, the freedom of speech argument is a very tricky one, and I'm actually surprised that all of a sudden this has become about freedom of speech. What happened was wrong. Violence will never be excused, but the freedom of speech argument is a sophist one. Charlie Hebdo actually fired Maurice Steyn in 2010 because he published a cartoon in Charlie Hebdo that was viewed as anti-Semitic. It attacked someone in power. It was Sarkozy's son. And he took him to court. They fired him. They told him either you write a letter of apology or not. He said, no, I would rather, je préfère couper mes couilles. And he ended up getting fired and going to court. He eventually succeeded, but my point is there are limits on freedom of speech, and you have to have good taste. And I think it's very important not to attack marginalized groups. This goes to the French argument of the situation in France. You have a group that's marginalized, that is suppressed and maligned in many ways. Anyone familiar with French society knows this. And so to pander to the majority at the expense of a suppressed minority, you're bound to have a backlash. And it's not progressive. It doesn't help move things forward, aside from it being in bad taste. So when you have things like the Prophet Muhammad having a turban on his head in the shape of a bomb, that's not contributing anything. That is contributing to the hatred of this group. And that trickles down, Evan, in society. You end up having, and this is what we deal with in our organization, you got people who can't find jobs despite being qualified and going to university. Why? Because of their backgrounds. When you start to spread these views in a society, the majority starts to shun this targeted group. And now you have a marginalized group, and you got a problem.
Fair enough. This is a debate we're going to continue having. On the other side, there's free speech arguments that you defend the things that even you find repulsive yourself. On the other side, there's slander and there's danger. And so, societies are trying to balance this line, and it's a real debate. Obviously, now we're talking about it at a very sensitive time as we watch that situation in France. Mohamed El Rashidy is the director of the Canadian Arab Federation. He's on this show regularly. Great to have you on the program, responding to Mark Steyn before the break. Fascinating debate. I always appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks.
Thanks, man.